Welcome everyone. This nerve-wracking day and in these nerve-wracking times. It's good to see you. My name is Daniel Loick. I teach political and social philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. And I welcome you to this second installment of our series of online events called Critique of Violence. And the aim of this series is to shed light on the several aspects of state-inflicted violence, as well as on political perspectives of overcoming them. The occasion for this series is that 100 years ago, quite precisely 100 years ago, Walter Benjamin penned his short essay of the same name, offering a radical refusal of all forms of violence connected to the law, calling also for, quote unquote, an abolition of state power. This essay begins with the question whether, quote, whether violence as a principle could be an ethical means even to just ends. By focusing on the question of the legitimacy of the means, violence as a means, Benjamin enables a critique of all forms of legal violence independent of the concrete form of the state. He criticizes democratic as well as authoritarian or tyrannical forms of statehood. As one of the very few texts in philosophical history, he, for example, turns his attention to the foundational, or as he says, law-positing violence of nation-states, as represented in colonialism and military occupation, but also on law-preserving violence, such as the police. Benjamin also explores alternatives to state violence that he finds both in the Jewish legal tradition of non-coercive forms of commandment, but also in everyday interaction anchored in the experiences of, for example, peaceableness, courtesy, and trust. He demands from us not only to rethink the categories of the law, but also categories of social transformation, expressing deep reservations with revolutions that only want to replace one form of government with another. This series, however, is not about Benjamin's essay in the narrow philological sense. It rather attempts to bring together scholars from different regional and theoretical backgrounds and invites them to address the topics present in this essay from their own political and philosophical perspective, utilizing conceptual tools developed in their respective theoretical traditions and fields of activity. Benjamin's essay thus does not serve as the basis for philological interpretation, but as an inspiration and a starting point to explore the question of violence from several distinct, locally bound taxonomies. Many of the topics raised by Benjamin in this essay a century ago are still of pressing urgency today. States have aggregated an unprecedented amount of violence and prove to be no longer capable to contain or mitigate it by means of democratic control or judicial oversight. Mass incarceration, police brutality, internment and deportation, military interventions are but the most visible instances of state-inflicted violence, which in addition often work hand in hand with extra-legal forms of violence against marginalized and vulnerabilized groups. At the same time, a multitude of political movements has formed to protest and to resist these forms of violence, be it prison abolitionist groups, Black Lives Matter movement, or refugee and no border activism. These groups often do not simply reject contemporary instances of violence, but also at the same time try to come up with alternative models of political autonomy, conflict resolution, and criminal justice beyond the state and legal coercion. Benjamin's essay is also one of the very few texts in the history of political and legal philosophy to scrutinize a form of state-inflicted violence that otherwise enjoys unquestioned acceptance, namely the police. Police are, as Benjamin says in his essay, a ghostly presence in the life of civilized states. They are like ghosts because they stem from two different worlds. As part of the executive, they are supposed to be a merely law-preserving violence, to be a means of securing the force of law. But the police tend to emancipate themselves from the status as a means and begin to set ends for themselves. Police do so in the form of ordinances and orders, but also in the form of everyday interpretations of the law, structurally placing them in a position to be temporary sovereigns, enabling them to execute quotidian and gratuitous violence. Today, we talk about policing in Europe, but we also will at least try to also talk a little bit about abolitionist alternatives to the police. And I'm very excited and grateful that I could convince, in my opinion, the best scholar to address these eminent questions. Eminent scholar on matters of European policing, who's also an activist, to give a talk on this topic within this series. Vanessa, it's very good to see you. Vanessa Thompson is a research associate at the Viadrina University in Frankfurt an der Oder, and she works, among other things, on critical racism and migration studies, Black studies, post and decolonial feminist theories, abolitionism and transformative justice models, and especially questions of policing and resistance. Her dissertation was on solidarities in Black, anti-Black racism, and the struggle beyond recognition in Paris. And currently she is, among many other things, conducting a postdoctoral research project entitled Policing Blackness in Europe. She has countless publications in these areas, and just wanted to name two essays that are very much connected with today's topic. We have to act. This is what forms collectivity, Black solidarity beyond identity in contemporary Paris, an essay that appeared in 2019 in Locating African European Studies, Interventions, Intersections, Coalitions, with Routledge. And another essay that is forthcoming, something to look forward to, Policing in Europe and Abolitionist Intersectional Care, the Case of Madness in Race and Class. Before I hand over the virtual microphone to Vanessa, I just wanted to quickly thank the hosts or sponsors of this event. The series of events is supported by the Philosophy Department of the University of Amsterdam, and especially the Philosophy and Public Affairs Group, the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, ASCA, the Netherlands Institute for Cultural Analysis, NICA, and the Goethe Institute in Amsterdam. And as I said, the first part of the event will be recorded. So now when Vanessa is talking and my introduction will be recorded, but I will then stop the recording. So when you will raise a question during the discussion, you won't be recorded. The talk will be about 50 minutes long, and then we'll have still quite some time for a Q&A and for a discussion. And the way it worked the last time with the first event, it worked quite well to simply unmute yourself if you want to say something. But if that doesn't work well and too many people want to say something at the same time, it will become too chaotic, then please use the raise your hand function in Zoom. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna again welcome you very much, Vanessa. It's good to have you, and I hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Daniel, very much for the introduction and for setting up this important series, for organizing and coordinating it. I'm happy to be part of it and to be in conversation with you all, and also to be here today, though only online. Unfortunately, Daniel already mentioned it, It's difficult times, nerve-wracking times, so please also bear with me. I was crawling yesterday, and it was really difficult to even think of finishing this talk, and many know actually who have already heard about it. You will see that some parts are only news because it was really difficult yesterday to concentrate, and it still is, but at the same time I do feel the spirit, and these are some of the moments like yesterday where I think, and I turn to inspirational scholars such as Toni Morrison, and I want to share something she once wrote. It was actually after the Trump inauguration, and I do hope that Trump is not going to that it's not 4 years of Trumpism again, but actually this gave me force yesterday to take rest, but also to imagine, to further imagine. Toni Morrison said, "This is precisely the time when artists, and I would say critical theorists and organizers also go to work. There is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal." So I'm happy with you also to talk about actually what needs to be done urgently, and I'm happy to be here. I have prepared a PowerPoint that I would like to share via the screen sharing. I hope this works. Oops, I have to like this. Okay. So as we continue to see global protests for Black lives, they spark the streets massively in summer in the US, but also in Europe, various countries on the African continent, but also Asia. And these actually continue in forms of organizing in the midst of a pandemic. A systematic revision of academic concepts and understandings, which often fail to account for Black lives, seems to be long overdue, also with regard to the European context. These protests and struggles often crystallize around policing. Just think painfully of the murder of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and many more, and not only in the US. Intensive policing, the expansion of the carceral condition, and mass criminalization are some of the most flagrant expressions of the current phase of gendered racial capitalism. Through the regulation and illegalization of migration, the war on crime and poverty, Black and other racialized subjects are rendered particularly vulnerable to modalities of state violence and premature death across the global North and South. So in my talk today, I want to talk about the various modalities of policing Black lives in Europe, and we'll touch on some abolitionist horizons. As many of you know, that policing Blackness is by far only a US phenomenon. In my analysis, I depart from current debates and accounts around racialized policing in European contexts, namely Germany, Switzerland, and France, where I myself do research on policing Blackness from a Black feminist perspective, and I'm also engaged as an organizer. Now, since more than a decade, I've just seen yesterday, actually it was 9 years ago that we did a manifestation in for Christi Schwundeck. I will talk about her case also. And I especially look at the policing of Blackness and discuss the coloniality of modern policing as the condition of unbreathing from a Black feminist framework, which also urges us to rework critical theories of policing, including Benjamin's critique of violence. By interrogating the mundane registers of structural, slow, and silent violence through policing, from the transnational to the translocal, from the prison cell and the lager to the urban or domestic space, from the land to the shores and the sea, I will link Fanon's analysis of combat breathing with Black feminist theorizations to show how the metaphor and materiality of unbreathing haunts Black subjects. And the structure of the talk actually goes as follows. I will first talk about some of the pitfalls or the gaps of critical theories of policing. And I will then turn to policing as a modality of unbreathing, and we'll close with some ideas on abolitionist horizons, or we'll actually draw on some of the practices. But before doing this, I do want to say that I'm always, in terms of working on anti-Blackness and on anti-Black violence and policing Blackness, there's this kind of this oscillation between talking about cases of Black people who've been murdered by police, and at the same time not reproducing these forms of violence. And this is, of course, a critical conundrum, which I think Catherine McKittrick have put into words brilliantly by saying the following: there are always two things of my mind when I'm researching or writing about Blackness, Black geographies, and practices of violence, the repetitive circulation of anti-Blackness from past to present and back, and the ways in which we take up racial violence in our academic work. I'm concerned with the ways our analysis of histories and narratives and stories and data can actually honor and repeat and cherish anti-Black violence and Black death. If our analytic source of Blackness is death and violence, the citation of Blackness, the scholarly stories we tell, calls for the repetition of death and violence. So I'm saying this to actually make, in a way, transparent that it's never easy to think about anti-Black violence, to think about policing Blackness. And I will talk about some of the cases of the people who've been murdered by police in Europe, but I also try to actually talk about the struggles in terms of that these people will not be forget, and what activists do actually to keep their spirits, and also to keep them alive, at least in memories, as a form also of abolitionist practice in terms of remembering. So I'm coming next to some points of coloniality of critical theories of policing. Critical social theories of policing depart from heterogeneous approaches and analyze the forms, effects, characteristics, and mechanisms of policing in relation to societal systems of power and oppression. In these critiques, police is often understood as a societal relation of power, which reproduces discourses and ideologies of criminalization that go beyond the mere institution of the police. Some of these critiques do not only critique policing against the backdrop of judicial measures, but rather go beyond the logic of liberal law and question the legitimacy of policing on the basis of its paradoxical relation to the law. Like Walter Benjamin would be one example, but there are, of course, also others. According to some of these approaches, police is also understood as involving its subjects in terms of subjectivation. Louis Althusser described the scene of modern subject formation through the interpellation by police. Hey, you there. It is through being hailed by police that the subject becomes a subject. The modern subject of rights is thus a subject constituted by and through policing. Simultaneously involved in the logic of law and order, the modern rightful subject not only recognizes its subjectivity, but further recognizes and desires itself as a subject with rights, and here I'm also referring to property rights, that must be protected. These approaches and many of the contemporary critiques of police that depart from these strands in critical theory often fail to acknowledge the ways in which race and racism have been actually fundamental to the configuration of the modern world, its colonial undersides and regimes of securitization. An engagement with the imperial and colonial histories that shape the modern institution of police in the present enables not only an important reconceptualization of what is commonly understood as safety and security, but they further allow to understand the long-standing production of premature death, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore terms racism actually, that increasingly becomes visible through neoliberal regimes of securitization. Now I want to briefly sketch out two of the many gaps actually that seem to haunt critical social theories of policing. The first one is methodological eurocentrism. The modern institution of police cannot only be understood in the framework of the constitution of European nation states. Western European nation states were rather colonial empires, as Gominda Bamra and many other post and decolonial theorists actually urge us to remind. They were rather colonial empires than nation states and were constitutively connected with gendered racism and colonialism. So framing the history of police within the national frames of European national states violently erases that policing and regimes of security were geographically, historically, politically, but of course also epistemologically bound to the regulations of premature death, the super exploitation, enslavement, and colonization of racialized and indigenous populations. In the colonial laboratories of European colonial powers, places that were characterized by the law of death, technologies of capture and policing, categorization, observation, and criminalization, various practices and strategies were actually developed and exercised upon colonized subjects. Further, these strategies often traveled back to the colonial metropoles in form of a boomerang effect, like Aimé Césaire, for instance, has explained. The imperative of national security constitutively went along with the imperative of the securitization of colonial and imperial governance and super exploitation, which speaks to the presence of police in European colonies. Frantz Fanon writes in Le Damné de la Terre, the colonial world is a world cut in two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. In the colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official instituted go-betweens, the spokesman of the settler and his rule of oppression. In capitalist societies, the educational system, whether lay or clerical, the structure of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary honesty of workers who are given a medal after 50 years of good and loyal service, and the affection which springs from harmonious relations and good behavior. All these aesthetic expressions of respect for the established order serve to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and of inhibition which lightens the task of policing considerably. In the capitalist countries, a multitude of moral teachers, counselors, and bewilderers separate the exploited from those in power. In the colonial countries, on the contrary, the policeman and the soldier, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rufflebuds and napalm not to budge. Fanon spells out the systematic violence enacted by the police in the colonial situation. He also speaks to the connection here between the police and the military, especially if you read these passages further. And there he shows that actually that a clear cut between police and military cannot be drawn. Now, I'm not suggesting that the colonial situation Fanon analyzed can be equated to the post-colonial moment we are looking at here, or we find ourselves in. Colonial genealogies of the present demand specific contextualization and the tracing of the entanglements of reformulations and rearticulations of ever-shifting colonial marks. However, his analysis tells us something crucial about the inherent relation between race and policing when we think about debates on the militarization of police in racialized urban districts, as well as about the discussions around consent and coercion, for instance, but also about the kind of differential function of policing. The second crucial void concerns the realm of subjectivation. Althusser seems to ignore racialized and gendered subjects that are also racialized and gendered through policing in his thoughts on interpellation. Now let me spell out a thought experiment. Could it be that the subject in Althusser also turns around because he can be relatively sure, or they can be relatively sure, that they will not experience repressive force by the police? How about individuals whose everyday is impregnated by direct or indirect repressive control of the police? Isn't it most likely that they will try to escape from the control? Now here's a banner from a manifestation in the struggle for Teoluaka and Adama Traore, mainly waged in the urban racialized working class districts of French outer cities. Theo Luaka was brutalized and sexually violated by the French police in February 2017, and Adama Traoré died in police custody in July 2016. So what we see here is actually the claim that Theo and Adama remind us why Ziad and Bouna ran away. Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré were actually the two youngsters who were electrocuted in October 2005, while they were trying to escape from a racist police control. So this claim actually speaks to the condition of constantly being on the run. And at the same time, it also painfully speaks that either being on the run or like being stopped actually both ends in situations of violence against Black and racialized youth and subjects. So it is a condition, this constantly being on the run, that is stopped by policing itself, as Assa Traoré and Adama Traoré's sister actually explains. Now I want to bring this account of running away or constantly being on the run into conversation with Fanon's description of anti-Black racialized embodiment, the inscription of race and anti-Blackness onto the skin, from his key scene from Peau Noire Masque Blanc. And then the occasion arose when I had met the white man's eyes. An unfamiliar weight burdened me. The real world challenged my claims. Look, an N. It was an external stimulus that flicked over me as I passed by. I made a tight smile. Look, an N. It was true. It amused me. Look, an N. The circle was drawing a bit tighter. I made no secret of my amusement. Mama, see the N. I'm frightened. 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 Now they were beginning to be afraid of me. I made up my mind to laugh myself to tears, but laughter had become impossible. I could no longer laugh, because I already knew that there were legends, stories, history, and above all, historiosity, which I had learned about from Jaspers. Then, assailed at various points, the corporal scheme crumbled, its place taken by a racial epidermal scheme. Now, Fanon did not encounter the police in the train. However, the interpellations of the white child point to the dimension of everyday and institutional anti-Blackness. And I argue that the epidermalization described by Fanon is forcefully mobilized in police interpellations of racialized subjects, of Black subjects in particular. Furthermore, a Black interrogation of Althusser's interpellation demonstrates that race is a key modality of modern subject formation. The constitution of the modern subject as a rightful subject, one that wants, needs, and desires to be protected, and this includes property rights, which are always racialized and gendered, needs to be rethought towards the question from what or who it has to be protected. So linking modern subject formation with the development of racial capitalism and its modes of policing and punishment, we can begin to understand that the policing of race, of Blackness in particular, is constitutive for modern subject formation. Thus, the interpellation by police constitutes its racialized and gendered other. So in a way, the subject that perceives itself as a subject of rights, this kind of subjectivation is actually based on the policing of Blackness and of race. Now, I want to add two further pitfalls which we encounter with regard to often recited critical theories of policing. Walter Benjamin has impressively argued that policing is structurally excessive, and Daniel has discussed this in great detail, meaning that police is an institution in which law preserving and law making are both present and enacted, thereby suspending the difference between means and ends as police constantly undermines and makes law. Its power is formless, Benjamin writes, like it's nowhere tangible, all pervasive, ghostly presence in the civilized state. While all pervasive as a societal relation within the workings of gendered racial capitalism, policing from its underside, if we think with Fanon, for instance, is very tangible, materially experienced, and maybe not that ghostly. A Black radical analysis of policing demonstrates that what might be ghostly for some is actually a brick wall for others. Thus, Benjamin develops a crucial critique of policing, misses to engage with those groups that systematically experience how police could not only make law, but constantly does make law, how this is related to coloniality and geographies of state violence and carceral geographies. Such an epistemological perspective makes a crucial difference. So it's the question actually, from where do we think, or from where do we depart in our analysis of policing? And this makes a crucial difference, as we have also seen regarding the examples of interpellation. Now I want to give one further brief example, turning to a Black radical feminist critique of Foucault. Ensuing from a Black feminist perspective in Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, Simone Brown analyzes the surveillance of Blackness in a reinterpretation of Foucault's considerations of penal and disciplinary regimes. She shows that the objection of Black life, as in plantation economies and European colonies, through entangled forms of accumulation of racialized and gendered people, which at the same time constitutes them as non-people or as non-humans, is constitutive for the development of European modernity and the European episteme. Brown demonstrates how contemporary surveillance technologies and practices are linked to the history of enslavement and surveillance of Black people. In contending with Foucault's conceptualization of disciplinary power, through which Brown draws a Black line, she highlights how sovereignty and disciplinary power and the disciplining and regulation of Black bodies are entangled. Based on the plans and spatial arrangement of power on the Brooks enslavement ship, for instance, which was built in 1781 under the direction of Joseph Brooks, a slave trader, and operating from 1781 to 1804, many times with enslaved people on the ship, separated by gender and dehumanized as cargo, chained together side by side or stacked on top of each other, Brown shows that the control and surveillance of Black bodies on the ship are based on violence onto their bodies. Subjugated to the mercy of varied conditions of premature death, just on the cusp of survival, the Black enslaved bodies were arranged in such a way that they were absolutely controllable and fixed. As a constitutive underside, the racial power that produces premature death shapes the development of disciplinary power. However, disciplinary power does not replace it. Rather, it remains its constant companion. Brown shows that these forms of power cannot be separated, and that race as an intersectional principle essentially constitutes the forms of control and disciplinary power in the penal society. Now, plantation power, so to speak, was always linked to forms of sovereign power. That's actually Simone Brown's argument, which was the condition for the confinement of the Black body. Plantation surveillance was an exercise of both sovereign power and racialized disciplinary power, working simultaneously, discretionarily, and in prescribed fashion, as both were put to use in plantation societies to render slave life expendable. The fact that the control of Black people in the United States context of enslavement continues to operate even after the formal abolition of enslavement via sovereign power has been historically demonstrated by the continuity of public spectacles like the executions of Black people, such as in the case of state-sanctioned lynchings. And I want us here to also think about the continuation of lynching in forms of police killings. Brown invokes this exemplarily and in conversation with Foucault's account of the execution of the failed assassin of King Robert François Damiens in Paris in 1757 by analyzing the execution of the enslaved Black woman Marie-Joseph Angélique in 1734 in Montreal. Angélique was accused of setting fire to the property of her mistress, and thus endangering a large part of Montreal, for which she was subsequently sentenced to death, carted through the streets of Montreal, and then hanged. Angélique's body hung in the street for all to observe hours, and some say even a day after her execution. Brown brings these two executions into conversation not only as metaphorical aids. She shows that while the penal regimes have changed for Foucault, and with this change, disciplining, dressage, and subjugation of the body are carried out through surveillance, self-discipline, and routine as dominant forms, this does not apply to the historical formations of anti-Black racist power in the same way. While Foucault argued that the decline of the spectacle of public torture as punishment might have marked a slackening of the hold on the body, this chapter contends that when that body is Black, the grip hardly loosened during slavery and continued post-emancipation with, for example, the mob violence of lynching and other acts of racial terrorism. Brown's Black feminist reading of Foucault's disciplinary power impressively emphasizes that the creation and production of compliant bodies runs along gendered and racial coordinates. The change in power relations that Foucault elaborates therefore only applies to certain bodies. And I think when we consider policing of Black bodies, the often open violence that comes with it, the normalization of killings of Black people, and the spectacularization thereafter speaks strongly to this. Now I want to turn to some of the lived experiences and account of the policing of Blackness as they further prove to ground a Black radical critique of policing. Lived experiences of racial profiling, for instance, if we look at the case of racial profiling, entail being criminalized, being humiliated in the public as well as in the private, being addressed with racist language as well as psychological and or physical violence, as well as death. The documentations and reports of anti-racist organizations and people of color collectives describe the manifold and various consequences of racial profiling. The appropriation of the racialized body via the police. And here I want to think about policing also as a property relation in terms of that the state renders racialized, especially Black bodies, state property. So the appropriation of the racialized bodies via the police entails a severe restriction of the freedom of movement of Black and racialized subjects. As such, racial profiling can be described with Zahra Ahmed as a stopping device, a device of indefinite detention through which the existence and freedom of movement of racialized bodies is not only denied, rather, our bodies become borders themselves. This practice of bordering through police interpellation reproduces societal racism and anti-Blackness as it replicates the hegemonic representation of police stopping and searching the right ones. Moreover, police subjects have to do the labor of decriminalization often by themselves after the control took place, as they have to clarify that they have done nothing wrong. Policing takes time, as George Lipsitz writes. This means that racial profiling does not end with the end of the actual control. Rather, as various initiatives that struggle against racial profiling emphasize, racial profiling extends the actual control in time, space, and embodiment. I find Rob Nixon's thoughts on slow violence helpful here, as he describes a form of violence that does not speak to the spectacular, but is rather dispersed through time and space. Many initiatives against racial profiling in continental Europe have been documenting how police subjects face stress from policing beyond the actual control. From the physical and psychological violence it enacts, depression, fear of prosecution, and panic attacks can develop. Further, there are no independent report offices in many of these continental European contexts. Moreover, and this points to the effects of societal racism, witnesses rarely speak on behalf of the victims of racial profiling. Lawyers are also difficult to find, as it is known that legal procedure against the police is rather hard to obtain. So like this, the criminalization of Black people and people of color is actually reproduced, also because they often have nowhere to turn to in terms of getting support, as they are further constructed as perpetrators, never as victims of police violence, who deserve care and protection. A current case from Switzerland demonstrates this. Wilson A., who was stopped and searched by the police on October 10th, 2009 in a tram after he came from a meeting with a friend and asked why the police only checks on him and his friend, was aggressively pushed out of the tram and then brutally beaten. Wilson told the police that he just had heart surgery, but the police continued and even insulted him with racist slurs. As stated in the many reports of support groups and his own testimony, Wilson A. could barely breathe. Breathing refers to the physical as well as to the social breathing here. Breathing is a form of being in relation in and with the world. It is exchange, relationality. It is the precondition for sociality and for being in contact with the human and non-human world. At the same time, each breath is new, world-making, as Ashton Crayley shows in Black Pentecostal Breath, the Aesthetics of Possibility. Now, I think about these experiences of unbreathing through a Fanonian framework and follow, among others, Imani Perry has written a bit on the notion of unbreathing, especially in her great book, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, but also Fred Moten has been thinking through breathing. So I try to think about this as a crucial and material motive which sticks to the policing of race, especially of Blackness, through time and space. And Fanon wrote, in relation to the colonial condition, that it is characterized by combat breathing, by a condition of always have to catch one's breath like in a condition of constant war. The reference to George Floyd's last words is of course striking here, but also think of Eric Garner, who died in a police chokehold in July 7th, 2014 in New York. His last words were, "I can't breathe." Think of the killing of police by Samuel Dolphin in Finland 2018, and of his friend who stated he was shouting and calling my name, "Ofori, Ofori, they are killing me, I can't breathe." Think of Adama Traoré, who died in police custody in July 2016, and his last words were, "I can't breathe." And William Tonum Bobda, who was brutally held on the ground and violated by security personnel on the morning of April 21st, 2019 in front of the University Hospital Hamburg-Eppendorf and died 5 days later. He had initially come voluntarily to the psychiatric department to seek psychological advice. Policing as unbreathing, however, is not always explicitly expressed in these ways. I'm thinking of the breath of fear of Christi Schwundeck, who was shot in a job center in Frankfurt am Main on May 19th in 2011, and De Mariam Sa, who was killed in July 14th in 2000 in the house of her ex-partner. And those are crucial manifestations also that we have to think of unbreathing also not only in terms of how it is expressed as the last words, for instance. In both of these cases, in the cases of Christi Schwundeck and of De Mariam Sa, 2 or more police officers as well as 1 more person were present, and Christi Schwundeck and De Mariam Sa were the only Black women in these respective situations. The Black refugee activist Sister Mimi, who was engaged in the refugee protests at the Oranienplatz in the Gerhard Hauptmann School in Berlin, died in December 11th, 2014. She continuously argued that the repression by police absorbs her breath. And think of the Black bodies in the Black Mediterranean, as several Black critical scholars have now done so important, crucial work on the concept, but also as kind of a condition, the Black Mediterranean as a condition, for instance, S.A. Smythe and other critical Black scholars. But the emergency was for the baby that was not breathing. They took her on the big ship and tried to reanimate her, but there was nothing to do, explained Hope, a mother of 3 children who lost 2 of her children while crossing the deadly waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Drowning is defined as a respiratory impairment, a specific form of asphyxia, as a result of being in or under liquid. The motive of unbreathing or combat breathing sticks to Black and racialized experiences with criminalization, policing, and death. It travels from the transnational to the translocal, from the prison cell and the lager to the urban or domestic space, from the land to the shores and the sea. Racial profiling in its everyday forms also speaks to forms of unbreathing, albeit not in lethal forms, being stopped, rushing to breathe during a check, getting out of breath when running away from police, like Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré in France. The condition of unbreathing is actually the stuff out of which security is produced and its effects simultaneously. And it constitutes what the Black feminist radical literary theorist Christina Sharp calls anti-Black weather. The weather is the totality of our environments. The weather is the total climate, and that climate is anti-Black. What I'm calling the weather, anti-Blackness, is pervasive as climate. Wilson R. filed charges. The police officer filed charges too. After 9 years, the 3 police officers were acquitted. The psychological, physical, and financial constraints that come with such a process are part of the slow violence of and through policing. Black and other racialized subjects are not perceived as victims in the hegemonic economies of perception, even if they were the ones who called the police. The case of Derge Webelsieb, who you see here in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, demonstrates this. After racist ticket control in a metro, he in October 2012 called the police and was then beaten by the police. He called for support in front of his child, 3-year-old child actually, and his partner. Usman Sey, who died in a police cell in Dortmund 2012, called the ambulance, and instead of receiving medical care, he was arrested and died in police custody. The slow violence of racial profiling also works through the ways in which family members and friends of police victims are treated by those authorities and institutions. Closing of procedures or procedures that extend over years, racism during hearings, as in the case of the NSU complex, where the families of the victims killed by the NSU were actually accused of being involved in the killings. Family members and friends thus experience a continuation of anti-Black and racialized violence, which not only extends the actual control, but also the subject it was directed towards. So in a way, actually, that's where we can see that policing impacts whole communities in the most literal sense of the word, because it goes beyond Black subjectivity. One could say with Fred Moten, actually, it's Black existence that needs to be policed. So it's never just addressed against one Black subject or racialized subject. The sudden death of Uri Jallo's mother, Mariama Jambo Jallo, after she came to Germany the second time during the trial, is part of this form of slow violence. In the US context, one can think of Erica Garner, Eric Garner's daughter, who after her father was killed, became even more engaged in struggles for Black lives. She died with 27 because of a heart attack related to her asthma disease. That Eric Garner couldn't breathe, the condition of unbreathing, was already scripted symbolically before her death, as she carried the last words of her father, "I can't breathe," into the protest on multiple levels. Now, these accounts demonstrate that the policing of Blackness and racial profiling as unbreathing are deeply intersectional, of course, something that Black feminists have been emphasizing since decades, not only in the US. Amina Mama, for instance, has elaborated this in the context of the UK in 1993 in her work on policing and Black women. They remind us that Black people who live at the intersections of oppressions are particularly vulnerable to murderous policing. Black, especially dark-skinned Black women, queer, and especially trans and non-binary people, Black people with disabilities and mental vulnerabilities, working class and poor people, Black people rendered refugees and asylum seekers, illegalized sex workers. And many of the people I've been here referring to here lived at the intersection. The critical race theorist and activist Andrea Ricci thus calls for speaking of gendered racial policing. Sorry, I'm getting a bit. And there she says, I actually don't know how to, okay. The role of policing in upholding systems of gendered power relations, conventional notions of morality and sexual conformity cannot be overlooked. Gender and sex policing are not only important weapons of policing race and class, but critical independent functions of law enforcement. The context at stake here which I've discussed, of course, differ from the US context. However, the cases of Christi Schwundeck and de Mariam Sa, as well as, for example, the case of William Tonum Bobda, demonstrate that an intersectional perspective on racist policing remains necessary to not only analyze the ways in which police violence draws on intersecting modes of oppression, but further to account for the specific forms of policing and their spaces, because very often we're looking at the public space or we're looking at forms of custody, but like the so-called private or domestic space and welfare institutions are actually often neglected here. So we need to account for the specific forms of policing and their spaces that multi-marginalized gendered subjects and groups are exposed to. First, explorative studies, as well as the accounts of support groups and initiatives, show that especially Black sex workers, for example, are criminalized and are exposed to identity checks and searches. Black women, women of color, queers, and non-binary folks who work in the sex industry are particularly vulnerable to racist policing and its gendered implications, as they are controlled more often than their white colleagues and are under suspicions of working as illegalized sex workers. A higher frequency of controls can have severe impact on their lives, also in terms of, for instance, child custody regulations. Black and racialized mothers in general are often constructed as bad mothers and over-policed. This is also important with regard to the cases of Christi Schwundeck and de Mariam Sa, as their children were implicitly or explicitly involved in both cases. In the case of Schwundeck, she was struggling to get her child out of foster care, which also fed into her depression. A detailed, historicized, and contextualized critique of the gendered policing of race and Blackness, or gendered racial profiling, thus must interrogate the systems of policing and punishment, including abandonment, regimes of welfare and social services, foster care, and their implicit orders. Whereas multi-marginalized subjects and groups are particularly vulnerable to policing practices in their various and intersectional forms, the inaction of police when Black and racialist subjects are in danger and or go missing is also a modality which I defined as part of policing Blackness. This modality shows that racialized subjects, multi-marginalized subjects in particular, are not only constructed as perpetrators and violent offenders, but moreover fall through the cracks of perceptions and regimes of security and safety. The active inaction by police in the case of the Black asylum seeker, Rita Ovo-Oyunga, demonstrates this. Ovo was missing since April 2019. Her body parts were found in the forest near the Lagerhohen Leipzig in Brandenburg on June 11, 2019. It took police more than 2 months until they found her remain in the nearby forest. Though friends and her family continuously pressed that she was missing since April 7th. She had repeatedly reported sexual harassment in the camp before, and her son has repeatedly told his father and police that someone had violently beaten her before he brought her away from the camp on April 7th. Not only was Rita Ovo-Oyunga's son not believed, her reports on sexual harassment were further ignored, which points to the effects of sexotization of Black women and queer folks, a term that Jovita dos Santos Pinto actually coined, as well as to the intersectional violence within the Lager system. She was further implicitly criminalized as a bad mother who would leave her children by themselves without letting anyone know. It is the Lager system within European states and the outer borders where intersectional anti-Blackness as state violence and abandonment, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, condense. Policing where we go, or better, stopping our movement, containment, even before the pandemic. Fear of policing in the night because of deportation. Policing our bodies regarding reproductive rights, our children who often are denied birth certificates, no support in cases of violence but more violence, and the policing of our resistance. This is how I would describe my relation to policing as a Black woman, as a Black refugee woman in Europe, says Alma, with whom I talked some weeks ago about Blackness and policing in Europe. Black initiatives and collectives of color have long criticized and mobilized against racialized policing in Europe. And I think this is really crucial to not think of what is going on this summer as some kind of moment, or that we need to only look towards the US in terms of resistance or protest, or even the organizations around Black Lives Matter, because in Germany, in France, in Switzerland, where the context I'm looking at, but I'm really also sure in the Netherlands, as I know at least some Black organizers there must be a long tradition and a longue durée, so to speak, of struggles for Black lives. And this, of course, counts also for many contexts in Europe. And there are some newer as well as older organizations who have actually mobilized against this, criticized and challenged the racist status quo, and revealed that an institution which was constituted at the heart of modernity and in alleged protection of democracy actually produces the necropolitical gendered condition of unbreathing. Many of these groups actually have to engage with the often unthankful work of documentation, especially because this happens in contexts where often racist discrimination, so to speak, is not even legalized in a way. So there is no data, so to speak, except maybe in the UK, but that doesn't forcefully make things better. But what we see with a lot of these institutions or organizations, self-organized initiatives, is that they try to do documentation from below, statistics from below, we could maybe term it, in terms of making racialized profiling, modes of policing Blackness even visible. Not only to prove something to state institutions, but also to mobilize within communities, right? So even this is the kind of, one could say, legal strategies, but legal strategies are political strategies to mobilize political communities. Besides documentation, various initiatives support victims of racialized policing, racialized profiling by creating spaces in which police subjects can share their experiences and seek all kinds of support. And here to really work in terms of what the individual needs in terms of support structures. But also the sensitization of dominant society is part of these programs in forms of research, reports, video campaigns, workshops, alternative media, and creative interventions. Because of course we know that, like I've said, if we look at the experience from policing or prison from the receiving end, there's also, unfortunately, the end of subjects that conceive of themselves as rightful subjects, to speak with Althusser, that are the groups that actually call for others to be police, or that actually base their understanding as modern subjects on this condition of policing and the production of unbreathing. So it is important actually to also mobilize these groups and communities to understand that policing, or the police as an institution, but also policing as associated practice, does not ensure safety, but rather the contrary. And that's very difficult because actually their subject understanding often also relies on this kind of understanding of safety, or claiming the right to be a secured subject. So I think this gets very difficult here, and I'm often reminded of this when I talk to people and they ask, well, but what would we do without police? Like, people would say, like, we need safety. And I'm like, okay, if you, like, often abolitionists then try to argue, well, but if you think of this institution actually not as one of safety, but as one of violence, then you wouldn't ask the question that way, right? So I think this is really crucial work to undo the interpellation of policing. So of course, this part of sensitizing the dominant society, or really like trying to undo this mode of interpellation, which a lot of people who are listening today also are doing is crucial also. But of course, the claims of the organizations and initiatives often span from the abolition of preventive policing methods to the inclusion of racial profiling in anti-discrimination law, often as a legal strategy here also. But also moreover, especially in the German context now, there's the whole debate around, okay, it needs actually independent report and documentation offices. That is something that comes up again and again. So a place where people can actually go to report, but also to be supported. But there are also collectives and groups that draw on an understanding of safety that is neither grounded in nor based on violence. And I think here we can really also see an abolitionist genealogy within continental European contexts. These would be groups like, for example, Collectif Afro-Suisse in the French-speaking parts of Switzerland, but also Collectif Case Rebelle in France. In Germany, we have some collectives who have been doing important work, but Sisters Uncut is obviously in the UK, who have done some important works to think about not only the legalized anti-discrimination dimension, but rather really put into practice modes and practices of taking care of each other to actually keep the police away from communities, and at the same time working on or trying to approach also the interpersonal violence within communities. So Women in Exile, for example, in Germany, refugee women group is engaged in that, but also Les Migras, a group in Berlin who does anti-violence work. There was the Transformative Justice Collective in Berlin doing work on this, but obviously also Case Rebelle, Sisters Uncut. So I think we need to see also these kind of groups in the continuation, also within organizing in Europe, because often when we now think of abolitionist strategies, like the framework easily goes to the US, but I think especially when it comes to self-organized refugee movements and no border politics, abolition of borders, abolition of so-called Residenzpflicht, these were abolitionist struggles that are deeply engaged in the European context. And various also often black-led movements. These fugitive practices, developing modes of abolitionist care and taking care of each other, practices of memory making, and I do want to not just scroll over these because I find these really important, because I think memory making is really a part of abolitionist practice. It means to connect actually, and to stay in conversation and to stay in relation with the death, to stay in relation with those who have been killed. And this is a struggle for breath, because like I said before, breathing is being in the world. It's the possibility, the precondition for being in exchange with the world, with the human and non-human world. So I think these kinds of practices of memory making are crucial, very often fugitive. Very often we see them as murals or as tags or something, which then also disappear, but actually reinscribe. These are very important also signs and practices that actually open abolitionist horizons as a practice. And they operate at the outside of the modern proposed order of being, law, property, security. And I think they have a lot to offer to global articulations of Black life practices and the matter of Black lives, and for a world in which we can all breathe. Thank you.